welcome everybody to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer, and I can't tell you how excited I am for today's interview. I'm just super excited. So this is Mormon Sex Info podcast. Before we totally get started, I just want to give a plug for the podcast. It doesn't happen on its own. It does need donations. So if you're an avid listener, please send some monies our way. We would love to have a few dollars to help us just keep it sustainable. And you can do that on the website, mormonsex.info. We have a little donor box there where you can either do a one-time donation or kind of like a subscription. And it doesn't matter, like even $5 every now and then can be really helpful if that's all you can do, or we're not going to turn down bigger donations, that's for sure. And if you can't donate financially, one way that you can really help us is by just spreading the word and sharing these podcasts with people that you know and think it might be helpful for. So just getting the word out there. I'm passionate about sexual education, and that's why I do this work. So anybody who can benefit from listening to some of the leading experts in the country, which is why I'm so excited about today's episode. That's definitely who Linda Weiner is. She's just kind of a treasure in the United States and is the author or co-author of Sensate Focus in Sex Therapy and has a very rich history just professionally herself. And so I'm super excited to bring her to the program. Hello, Linda. Nice to.
Hello, Natasha. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I know I have seen you professionally on numerous occasions where I've listened to you teach. I was able to meet you in person at the latest Ishwish conference. So that was a treat as well. And for you to agree to come on my program is just a really wonderful thing. So thank you for spending this time with us and with my audience. All right. So why don't we just get started with just you telling us a bit about yourself? I mean, I guess I could give a formal introduction, but I don't know. I kind of hate it when people do that to me. So maybe I'm just projecting, but why don't you tell us a little bit about your story? How do you come to be a sex therapist? What's your educational background and maybe what's your interest background in this field?
Yes. Well, it is a kind of an interesting story because I'm one of those people whose last name helped determine the course of their life. My last name was pronounced Weiner growing up. And you can imagine that as a little kid, I got a lot of jokes about penises. And so very early, I was desensitized to sex talk, if you would. When I went to college, I changed the pronunciation to Weiner, but I think the historical use of my last name and the Oscar Mayer jingle jokes had a lot to do with me becoming more comfortable around sex. Plus, I was brought up in the era when the pill came into being, and I went off to college during the women's liberation movement time. So it was a kind of it was almost the flapper period, the 60s and the 70s. Was another one of those awakening periods of time. And I always knew that I wanted to be a social worker. I had an aunt, and this aunt was a social worker in Brooklyn, New York. And she was the happiest person I'd ever met. Generous, happy, good spirits. And I was like, I don't know, I want to be like her. And what she was a social worker. And so when at 12, I said, well, I'm going to be a social worker. And then I went to, through what kind of, work am I going to do in social work? I thought I wanted to do marriage and family counseling, but I went and got my master's degree in social work. And then, before that, I met Barry McCarthy, who was my professor, who's well known in the field. And I had my first sexuality course as a sophomore or junior in college with my mentor and friend, who's still a friend to this day, who's written extensively and is now writing a lot about sex and aging, Dr. Barry McCarthy. So I met him. He was influential. And then I got my master's degree, and I owed the state of Missouri either the money for my master's degree, or I was asked to work in child welfare for a couple of years to pay back my obligation. And at that time, the child abuse law was just passed, and they were looking for social workers to do child abuse work. And I got very interested in incest and child sexual abuse because I understood physical abuse. I understood neglect. I understood emotional abuse, how people who were abused themselves in these ways or neglected or mentally ill or had a drug problem might neglect or abuse their children. But I was really confounded by incest in that a lot of times the social workers wanted the perpetrator, often the dad or stepdad or male family member, but not always. But that was primarily who we saw in child welfare. The kids didn't want daddy roasted to death. They wanted daddy fixed because a lot of times, not always, a lot of times this was in other ways. They were good fathers, but they had this issue and it colored everything else that happened. So I got very interested in working with people who were sexually abused and survivors of sexual abuse. And I then moved into training in child welfare. And across my desk comes this proposal for Masters and Johnson, who are the people that invented sex therapy. Masters and Johnson was starting a child sexual abuse program. And I had a lot of chutzpah. And so I wrote him a letter that said, hey, I see that you're going to have this program. I don't know what you have available, but you need me. And they wrote me back in 2 days and said, come in for an interview. And I was hired as the co-director of the child sexual abuse program. And in exchange for working again on a stipend, I was trained in sex therapy. And then they hired me and I was there 5 years and went out on my own 5 years later. And I've been in private practice doing sex therapy, teaching, training, writing, and loving what I do. Mm-hmm.
What an amazing thing. I mean, so you trained with them. I mean, so do you want to tell us a little bit about what that was like, just to kind of be, under the mentorship of kind of like now quintessential people, right? In our section of the United States. Yes,
they are gods and goddesses. But, if you've seen the series Masters of Sex, which was on, I think, one of the HBO or one of those for a while, they were really nothing like that. Nothing like the characters there. But what an education. I got to sit in the room while Bill Masters was doing therapy. And it was a co-therapy team where there was a male and female therapist, because the thought was that women understand women and men understand men. And so each person had sort of a supportive person to help in the therapeutic process. So people at that time came from all over the world because Masters and Johnson was the only available professional organization that did sex therapy. So I got to meet amazing people. I got to train with amazing people. And it was terrific. Couples would come in from all over the world and you would work with them 1 or 2 times a day. You'd see these couples. It was short-term intensive treatment. And so you worked 7 days a week. And the only days you got off were Christmas and New Year.
Oh, wow.
I didn't even get off on my birthday, which was also Bill Masters' birthday, the 27th of December.
Oh, wow.
So after 5 years of that, I was like, okay, let's try a different format. So it was fantastic to work there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, that's amazing. Well, okay. So Masters and Johnson, they are the ones who developed this intervention, right? This Sensate Focus, which kind of like, I don't know, sex therapy intervention 101, right? It's probably the most well-known sex therapy intervention. And yet, as your book describes fairly well, it's kind of done in a lot of interesting ways. There's a lot of different ideas about how it's taught or implemented, and it's not necessarily always implemented in the ways that maybe it was originally intended, or even ways that it's necessarily effective. And so why don't we maybe start there a little bit as far as what is Sensate Focus? What is its purpose? What is it trying to address? Yes?
Yeah, it is the simplest and most potent technique that I've ever seen. It is a series of graduated touching opportunities that couples or individuals are given that teach the person to shut off the thinking part of the brain, where we make all the other decisions in our lives, where everything else emanates, to shut off this part of the brain and tune into the primal brain, which is where breathing, respiration, and sexual response happen. So for people who have become anxious about sex because they maybe have a performance issue, for people who are worried about how their partner is reacting or if they're doing the right thing. All of these are distractions which are in this part of the brain. And Sensate Focus, when you're touching and being touched in Sensate Focus exercises, you're supposed to turn off this part of the brain by focusing on an alternative thing to your worried thought. The alternative is what's going on in the body, temperature-wise, texture-wise, and pressure-wise. So sort of like if you have trouble sleeping, falling asleep, let's say you have a big presentation the next day and you're lying in bed saying, oh my gosh, I'm really nervous about the presentation, and you can't fall asleep because you're nervous. And then you start thinking, oh my gosh, if I can't fall asleep, I'll be unable to speak tomorrow. And that just raises your anxiety more. And so you can't fall asleep. The same is true with sexual function. If you are in your thinking brain worrying and creating anxiety and cortisol, it shuts down your sexual functions. So with sleep problems, they tell you to count sheep. And at first I thought, well, that's to bore you to sleep. You count enough sheep, you'll be sleeping because it's boring. But no, what it actually does, Natasha, is it takes your focus away from your worry about tomorrow or your worry about how you're doing sexually. And it focuses your attention. You can't turn off the brain, but you can focus it on something neutral that doesn't create cortisol. And when you're counting sheep, eventually your anxiety level decreases and natural function takes over and you go to sleep. So Virginia Johnson was really the inventor of Sensate Focus because she and Bill had noted from people with sexual problems that anxiety and watching themselves and performance concerns were, the primary problems with sexual function where there wasn't a medical problem. And so as a kid, Virginia was kind of high strung, and she remembered that her mom would trace her face ever so softly to help her relax and fall asleep. And so she thought, well, touch is so potent and it really relaxed me. Why don't we do this touching thing with individuals or couples who are in this part of their brain and tense, and maybe that'll help them relax and natural function. And sure enough, that's what happened. So Sensate Focus is a series of structured touching exercises, which starts out with very low expectations, no expectations, just the idea that you touch for yourself, you focus on whatever sensations are there in your body. And when your mind goes to something that's a distraction, you just return it to what's going on in your body. And so you learn to relax. You also experience the buildup of some sexual tension where you're touching, but nothing's supposed to happen. You don't have to get aroused. If you got aroused, you don't do anything with it. So it really reduces pressure and teaches a tool to move your thought from here and end up where you should end up in the primal brain. So it starts with no breasts and genitals. And when the individual or couple gets in the groove, you move to the next thing, breast and genital touching or mutual touching. And then it increases to more what we would call erotic kinds of contact, like genital to genital contact, but with no need to have arousal and a taboo against going further than we suggest. So it's kind of like two kids making out in the car before they got into, being sexual with each other, like hours and hours of making out. And most women in particular will say, that's the most aroused I've ever been in my life, is before I, did anything more than just kissing and maybe some light touching over clothes. So it kind of replicates that. And of course, the more it's a taboo against going further, the more it emulates that early time in our lives when we did spend a lot of time with kissing and touching and so on. Once we start being sexual, generally speaking, the phrase, you kiss the lips, you touch the breast, and you die for the pelvis. So it's the opposite of that. And when you're doing this touch, what generally also happens is that not only does your body relax and ultimately turn on, but you begin to feel more connected to yourself if you're doing it individually, or with a partner, you feel much more connected and cared about by the partner, whether there's arousal or not. So it serves the function of helping you relax, helping your body be able to respond, and helping you feel more connected to your own experience and partners to be more connected. So it does so many things, and it's such a simple technique and makes so much sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. And I want to go back to something you said just to kind of drive the point home that, you know, outside of medical conditions, you said that the underlying kind of most common issue is anxiety, and that anxiety, and I'm taking this from your book, is either disappointing yourself or disappointing your partner. And
Correct.
so much of what the purpose of this exercise is to decrease that anxiety. And you use the word in the book spectatoring, which is
Yes.
the word we use, right? It's kind of that, yes. You're looking like, what do I look like? What am I acting like? Am I acting the right way? Am I performing the right way? Are my love handles showing? Am I,
exactly. Is he looking at, or is she looking at my cellulite? Is my penis getting hard? Okay. Am I getting aroused or not? So those distracting thoughts create anxiety and feed anxiety. And anxiety is the opposite of what state we're trying to go for, a state that's called mindfulness. So for a lot of people, you know, when you are playing golf, for example, the idea is that you turn off the mind and that you are in this altered state of just being in that space in that moment without anxiety, but with pure concentration. And that is the state that Sensate Focus mindfulness techniques get you into. And when you're in that state, it may only last a few seconds, but like, oh, when I was in that state, I felt a blip of arousal. And then I noticed that I felt arousal. Then I was distracted and spectatoring, and then it went away. But I refocused on the neutral stuff, temperature, where on my partner's body, is he or she warmer or cooler, texture of skin and hair, and what are the differences, and pressure, the experience of having more or less pressure during the touch. Those are neutral things to think about. They take your mind away from the spectatoring into spectatoring, sort of, but you're focused on something neutral, not, is my partner having a good time? Am I looking thin enough in this position? You know, which are anxiety producing, spectatoring things. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned natural function, you know, as far as brain things, and you talk about this in the book quite a bit in regards to sex being a natural function. Can you explain a little bit what you mean by that?
Sure, absolutely. So what a lot of people don't know is that even before we're born, our bodies are responding to touch sensations. So we actually have pictures of baby boys in utero touching their penises. Now, obviously, or maybe not obviously, they're probably not having a sex fantasy, but they are simply experiencing the pleasure of touching in an area where there's a lot of nerve endings, and touching is pleasure. Now, we all touch ourselves in various ways. You know, sometimes we're doing this to like, oh, I can't believe I heard that. Sometimes we're thinking, you know, you can always see men with beards going like this. Yeah, ears, touching ears, pulling on ears, playing with hair. We're always touching. It is natural function to touch areas that give feelings of pleasure, not necessarily sexual pleasure. So when little kids are born, they will touch their genitals. It's very natural. And nobody teaches a baby boy how to get an erection. It's just a natural thing. But when he's 30 and he starts worrying about, am I going to get it? Am I going to keep it? When we start insertion, then it takes it out of its natural function and it introduces anxiety and performance. It only works like when the little kid is doing it, just for whatever it is, not for any particular purpose, just to experience whatever it is. So natural function is, we know how to fall asleep, but anxiety interferes with that natural function. We know how to urinate, but if you've ever been at a bar when you're about to start the flow of urine and someone bangs on the door and says, hurry up, or maybe you grew up in a house with one bathroom and a lot of kids. And so you're about to start this natural function of urination, And anxiety spikes because someone's pounding on the door, and it stops the natural function. So what I mean by natural function is sleep, digestion, tearing of the eyes, erection, lubrication, orgasm. These are all things that we don't have to be taught. What we have to teach people where that natural function has been corrupted by anxiety or trauma, we have to teach them to get their brain out of the way and let their bodies respond, because their body is wise. It knows what to do. Does that answer a little bit?
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. And of course, this, starts my brain going as far as, a therapist who works with a lot of religious folks, because there is kind of this paradox of trying to control natural function when it comes to sexuality a lot, in regards to masturbation or, sexual exploration or sexual developmental, steps of sexual exploration, married. Of course, our LGBTQ folks, are not expected to be kind of sexual at all. So these are things that I've been talking about on Mormon Sex Info for a long time. It's kind of like, on the one hand, we have these values or standards. On the other hand, we're interfering with natural function and the anxiety that this causes for people, and the dilemma, that puts people in as they try to figure out what's going to be the best, way forward for them as they navigate those things.
Yes.
And I don't, not that I necessarily expect you to talk about that much, because I will talk later about some of the actual sexual dysfunctions. And you did mention certain things that have correlations with religious upbringings, but I just wanted to kind of bring that up right now. That
yes,
that's one of the issues with religious
upbringing.
Absolutely. We are kind of, there is this anxiety that interferes with natural function.
Exactly. Because, and I have many clients of various religious backgrounds where chastity until marriage was a big value of theirs. And, these sweet couples that come to me, they're 25, 30 years old, and they've waited their whole life, and they're married, and they're supposed to enjoy the fruits of their sexual connection. But what happens to people, some people, is when you feel arousal and you want to stay true to your value, and you keep cutting it off and pushing it down and making it go away for fear that you'll violate your moral or ethical standards. Just because the ring gets slipped on the finger doesn't mean that that same reaction isn't going to happen when it's now approved to be sexual. Your body still and your mind still create the anxiety and the shutdown. So that is what I see as one of the challenges as a sex therapist to work with. Because it's really sad. They were supposed to do right by themselves and their religious beliefs, and then their reward was going to be, this wonderful sexual relationship honored by God and their community. And they have saved their virginity by shutting themselves down whenever they got aroused. And now that's what their body automatically does. So I do see a lot of this as, one of the things that leads to no desire or low desire, or problems with erection, or problems with arousal, or problems with orgasm. There's a lot of guilt and distraction and anxiety that has to be managed and overcome. Mm-hmm.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's a welcome to my practice.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it is sad, right? Yeah, it is sad, because I do think people, a big part of, and again, it's not everyone. Some people are able to really enjoy, marital sex and, within the confines of those standards.
Sure.
But when it doesn't work out, it's kind of like the disappointment of that promise not being with, like it's kind of like I did all this stuff to get to that reward, and yet I wasn't, that promise wasn't fulfilled on God's end, or on the religion's end, or why am I having this issue now, even though I did my so that can be really upsetting and feel like a betrayal. So, all right. So when you're talking about Sensate Focus, it was interesting because you also talked about kind of culturally, you mentioned like, Cosmo magazine, or, what are they kind of, what's the message? The message is that you've got to figure out how to please your partner. That's a big message. You've got to figure out how to be a good lover. So here's the 10 ways to give the best blowjob, or here's the the 5 ways that you're going to turn on your, your female partner's foot, right? Or, here's all these things. But really with Sensate Focus, you're talking about touch for self. You're talking about touch for interest, and you're talking about redirecting for distractions. These were kind of like 3 steps, which is very different than focusing on what is my partner like. And one of the things that you talked about right away is, how is this not like framed as selfish? Like, I'm not even going to worry about whether or not you're enjoying it, right? I'm going to worry more about what I'm feeling in the process. So why don't you talk about why that's actually working?
So yes, this is where my couples kind of open their mouth like, you don't want me to be a good lover for my partner? No, I didn't say that. I said, that's really not the goal initially. The goal initially is to touch for yourself and focus on your sensations and bringing yourself back and letting your body do what it's going to do. And the idea is sex is not, it's not selfish, but it is self-centered. And I say to them, when you're orgasmic, who or what are you thinking of? Are you thinking of your beloved? No. Are you even thinking about yourself? No, you are not thinking. This part of your brain has gone offline. You are purely experiencing, not thinking. What we're going for is sort of, people can relate to this. A lot of people get in the shower, and when the water temperature is just right, and you put your head back and you go, you're purely wrapped up in sensation. And that's what we're going for. Okay. Now, the part where partner is important is, if I'm touching for myself, I need to know that my partner is going to protect me from doing anything psychologically or physically uncomfortable. So if I'm touching for myself in this beginning practice, focusing on the sensations for whatever they are without evaluating, and I'm doing something that my partner finds annoying or disquieting, the partner is going to let me know by moving my hand or by saying, please change this up. And rather than seeing it as, I'm not being the magic toucher, oh my, I'm failing, it's supposed to be seen as, oh, how nice, my partner is being vulnerable and letting me know that's not okay right now. But I can go back to it, and he or she or they will redirect me if need be. But here's how touching for self becomes something more. So if I'm touching my partner and they are responding, I'm going to probably keep doing it because their response is something of interest to me. So I'm touching for myself, but their response is intriguing me. I'm going to keep with it. And now, am I touching for them or am I touching for me? So it integrates.
Right?
Exactly.
It's like a snowball effect.
Exactly. And many people will say the turn on to them is their partner's turn on. And that's the feedback loop that we will eventually get to. Now, after there's no sexual problem left, let's say there was a problem of anorgasmia. The second stage, once the anxiety is gone and once the sexual difficulty is gone, now I'm encouraging couples to tell the other person what they'd like to try or what new or inventive thing they're interested in, and to give feedback about what they do like once we're through the initial part of the therapy. But people have such a difficult time with this notion of touching for myself because, as you say, the culture is all based on being a good lover. And Sex in the City, where the idea was to be, out there and highly sexual and a good lover. And, the Sleeping Beauty story is really a metaphor where the prince kisses her and she awakens. It's really a metaphor for sexual awakening and the pressure on men for women to be naive about what pleases them and for men to unlock their sexuality. So even in that little story in our culture, we are raised with this idea that it's you give, but you don't touch for yourself.
Yeah. And there's so many issues in regards to right where we started this conversation
Yes.
about that creating that anxiety. And I loved how you mentioned that. I talk about it from kind of like a sexual ego perspective. I feel like we all have fairly fragile sexual egos because you're right. When we grow up in this culture where I'm supposed to make things happen for you, and if you don't seem happy about it, then I'm like, all hurt feelings, right? And
Yes.
oh no, this is now this the fact that your body didn't respond well is a reflection on me. You know,
Yes.
I'm bad, I'm not good. And so therefore our sexual egos have not really been very resilient. And therefore in a lot of couples, what I see is happening is people put up with a lot of not great things because they don't want to hurt their partner, right? They don't want to offend their partner or make their partner sad or, you know, worry about that reaction. And so they won't tell their partner something hurts or is uncomfortable, or they don't like to, or they're faking orgasms, or they're not telling them about genital pain or, oh my goodness, right? So I love that you said, you know, oh, actually that redirection, like, thank you for letting me know. That's wonderful. That's actually, that's really helpful feedback.
Yes. It means we're being open and vulnerable with one another. And sex is one of the most vulnerable things that humans do. So absolutely.
Yeah. And the book does talk about two different types of Sensate Focus, right? We've been mainly talking about Sensate Focus 1, which is very much about this initial space where we're really connecting ourselves and this mindfulness practice with ourselves first, knowing ourselves. Then we can kind of move into Sensate Focus 2, which is that more relational space. And there's some really wonderful kind of directions about doing Sensate Focus with yourself, just solo Sensate Focus, which again, in my community, this is a little tricky because we're not super masturbation friendly, right? We're not super solo sex friendly. Although it depends, you know, I work with Mormon couples where if it seems to be helping the relationship, they're actually very comfortable with incorporating solo sex practices, especially if they see that as something that's going to help the relationship. There's also Mormon people who are like, we don't see any problem with masturbation. And then of course there's Mormon people who are like, no, this is really a problem regardless, right? So kind of a spectrum in my community as far as how people feel about this. But could you talk a little bit about why this might, I mean, you kind of alluded to things with the Sleeping Beauty metaphor, but why might it be really healing or important to do some Sensate Focus individually, and where might that be indicated?
Yeah, absolutely. So I find it's particularly helpful for people, a big segment of the, I don't know how big, but, you know, sexual abuse of children is more endemic than our statistics probably tell us. And so one of the ways that people cope is to be out of the body. They're focused on the light at the top of the stairs. They're focused on the pattern in the curtains. They're focused everywhere but in their body. There's nobody home during the process of their being abused. Quite often they distance themselves. So they're alienated from their body, and they have to learn how to be in their body and to allow physical touch to feel it and to register that feeling and to discover places that it relaxes them and places that they can neutralize that maybe have been places that other people have touched without their permission. But now I'm touching and I'm allowing the sensations and I'm getting back into my body and honoring the feelings and the sensations. So for people who have dissociated from their body because of trauma, it's a very effective technique. Also, you know, there's a lot of people that live in their head. You know, in our society, we way value, going back to Descartes, and, you know, that the body is some dirty piece of trash that God invented for some reason. We're not really sure. But to be really close to God, we have to be in our head, not in our body. And so I think the negative attitude about the body goes way, way back. And a lot of people are affected by it. And, you know, there are people who forget to eat. There are people that don't use the toilet with great regularity because they get in their head doing whatever they're doing, and time passes and they're not in their body experience. The sort of the absent-minded professor would be another experience of this, or another, scientists are people that tend to live more in their head than in their bodies in general. I'm being very general here. So for those folks, learning to be in the body, including not just touch and sensate focus, but including while you're taking a shower or a bath, while you're walking, tune in to the swing of your hips and the movement of the air around you, instead of trying to solve the next equation in your brain while you're taking the walk for exercise. Okay. So learning to take pleasure in the things of the body, not just the sexual things, but in all things. And self-sensate focus is a way to both desensitize trauma and also have you become aware of what is going on in your body, because that's another source of great information. I tell my clients always that wisdom is the combination of mind, heart, and body and spirit. It is not one alone. So I try to emphasize that. And self-sensate focus is a great place to start.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And then moving from the individual space to more the relational space, you have this term called handwriting.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So initially, handwriting is used to let the partner know that something is too much, like moving the partner's hand away, or if the person being touched is feeling a little out of control, they might have had experiences of not being in control of their body, everything from sadistic tickling. You'd be amazed at how many people I see that don't like to be touched because as children, they weren't just tickled for fun. They were tickled in a power play. Mm-hmm. And so, to be touched is to lose control. And so putting your hand under the partner's hand, it's you doing the touching, you're guiding, and you're in control. And then you experiment with moving your hand and letting your partner touch you again. Or if something's a little ticklish, we prefer people don't talk during the sensate focus, because when you talk, you're in this part of the brain. Mm-hmm. And remember trying to get back here. Right. So we might ask them to put their hand on the partners, on top of the partners, to put a little bit more pressure, to communicate a little firmer touch so it's not so ticklish. Later, handwriting is used to bring the partner's hand to where you might like to explore the experience of touch. Mm-hmm. And later, it's handwriting to demonstrate, okay, baby, this is where and how I'd like you to touch me, okay, in this moment. So it's used at various stages in the treatment.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I love the handwriting. I think that's such a helpful thing. Whether you're doing sensate focus or not, I think those are really helpful tools to communicate during sexual activity. And again, not be worried about your sexual ego, but to actually welcome that kind of feedback.
Yes.
It's like, oh, you're going to teach me how you like to be touched. Woohoo. Or you're going to be open to letting me show you what kind of rhythm I like. Woohoo. Like, this is amazing. This is awesome. This is really fun. All right. I'd like to talk a little bit about, just from an educational perspective, not to put down religion, but I do think it's important for us in religious communities to understand that the research does show that certain sexual disorders do show up in higher numbers due to kind of what we were talking about earlier, with that kind of interrupting of sexual function or the increase of anxiety. So you went through several sexual dysfunctions, and you even kind of talked about the difference between a sexual disorder and just having a sexual issue. I think we all have sexual issues from time to time. Mm-hmm. That's pretty normal. That's different than having a disorder, which would be something that's happening kind of more chronically. It's happening over and over again for a longer period of time, which is usually 6 months or more. Mm-hmm. So the first one would be hypoactive desire disorder. So would you be willing to kind of share a little bit about, what that means and how that shows up and why there might be a religious component to that?
Mm-hmm. Not having sexual interest is one of the most common things that across, I think across the world at this point in time, and certainly across the United States, we're not having as much sex as we were even at young ages. But hypoactive desire or lack of desire for sex is often a byproduct, not often, but sometimes is a byproduct of the religious community, in which I can't think about sex. I can't have fantasies about sex. Anytime I do, I feel guilty. So I'm going to turn that off. And what happens then is, if we don't ever think about sex, or we don't ever notice sexual feelings, we take our brain and move it away from our body, and are not aware even if there is arousal. And there was an interesting study in which men and women were shown vignettes, 2 men being sexual, 2 women being sexual, a man and a woman being sexual, and bonobo monkeys being sexual. And they thought there was going to be a big difference between gay and straight men and women as far as what was arousing. And that was true when it came to the men. The straight men were more aroused to the male-female, secondly to the 2 women, not so much to the 2 men, and not anything to the bonobo monkeys. Same with the gay men. They were aroused to 2 men, most of all, and then the man and the woman, focusing on the male partner, not so much to the 2 women and not so much to the bonobo monkeys. But gay and straight women showed arousal to absolutely every one of the vignettes. But what was interesting was, when you interviewed the women, they did not know they were aroused, because they didn't want to be aroused to 2 bonobo monkeys, so they didn't notice their arousal. So in 2 ways, women seem to have an easier time disconnecting from their genitalia. And if you're also encouraged not to think at all about sex or have any sexual fantasies, which are completely normal and natural to have, doesn't mean you're going to act on them. It just means you're human. Then you're going to have low desire, because what stimulates desire is thinking about sex, feeling your body, noticing its responses. And if that's sort of bad girl, bad boy bred out of you, then you're going to report, oh, no, I don't have any sexual fantasies. Oh, no, I don't ever have a sexual thought. Oh, no, I don't ever notice any sexual stimulation. And it's not like, when a woman drives over railroad tracks, and I'm sure your listeners are going to enjoy this little story. When women drive over railroad tracks, there's a vibration. And often the clitoris is a very sensitive organ. If you were paying attention, you would feel a little vibration in your clitoris. It's not that you're going to pull off the road and masturbate. Oh my gosh, I'm so aroused. But it's just a noticing, Okay. It's just a noticing. It's not like, oh my gosh, I got to do something about it. But when that's bred out of you because it's sinful or it's bad or it's going to lead to you violating your moral code, it's not you take a normal thing and you turn it into something abnormal. And after a while, it kind of works, like just people that don't eat. And after a while, that seems easier and easier to do sometimes for people. So it's taking a normal function and twisting it to the point where it's no longer a natural function. And it's no longer going to help them build up sexual tension to, finally turn on and recognize that they're interested. So I think in the forbidding of fantasy and the forbidding of erotic tales and the forbidding of experiencing the body when it gets aroused as normal, that leads to this turnoff phenomena where you have separated from your own body.
So without putting you on the spot, because you can just tell me, well, I don't know, this is stuff I don't even want to talk about today because it doesn't really have to do with Sensate Focus, but this is like a dilemma I find myself in talking to my community, is because I've been talking about this a lot over the last 20 years. And at the same time, I have gotten feedback from asexual members of my community that I'm minimizing that orientation, which I don't want to do. And kind of bringing up this idea that loss of desire could have something to do with us having been religiously oppressed, right? And so, and I get this question a lot from women, am I asexual or am I religiously oppressed, right? And I think if you're questioning That's a really good question to be asking yourself. If
Mm-hmm.
you are identifying as asexual and you're comfortable with that identification, I think that's great. I think, I want to be more careful and mindful about how I'm speaking about this within my community in order to not minimize an asexual experience. And at the same time, bring this kind of correlation that we do know exists to the forefront as well. So yeah, what are your thoughts about how to navigate that kind of?
Well, I'm glad you brought it up, because there are people, we think we're just beginning to explore a little bit. And actually, I'm going to go to a training on this in June, because I don't know everything about everything in this field. So I'm still learning. So yes, is asexuality a real orientation? It was a question that now I think more people are willing to say, yeah, that probably is. And there's a bell curve for everything. There are people that are highly sexual and there are people that are not. And that is fine. The problem comes when they are people who want to be sexual and find that they're shut down and don't know how to open themselves up. And they are people who don't identify as asexual. People who identify as asexual and they're good with that. There may be some relationship issues to address in a partnership in which the other partner is interested in being sexual and interested in having a responsive sexual partner, rather than someone who will, agree to be sexual, but takes no real interest in it and is not terribly responsive. So asexuality is probably an orientation and not a big deal. But for those who have been repressed, who want to be sexual, that's another thing. And what I have discovered is there are a lot of people who take who decide that the most important value is to be celibate until marriage. But they may do a lot of other things sexually and have a great sexual relationship in a lot of ways, but don't go to the place of insertion or intercourse. And for them, I think with Catholics, we call them cafeteria Catholics. And I guess for Mormons, we haven't figured out a name, right?
Okay. We do have cafeteria Mormons too.
Okay. I'll take this and not this. So for a lot of the couples I see who are religiously affiliated and saved, they come to me not because they don't have sexual interest, arousal, responsiveness, but because maybe intercourse is terrifying for them. Mm-hmm. And so we work specifically with that.
Right. Right. Well, and it's interesting that your term, and I believe this was still under hypoactive as well, was you talked about service organization sex, which I've been calling duty sex or obligatory sex for a long time. So I was like, oh, that's an interesting term. So yes, it's kind of this idea that, and I see this much more often with wives, like I'm the wife. I think a lot of times in religion, it's kind of like the man is treated like, of course you're going to be sexual. Of course you just have to wait, but of course you're going to be sexual. The wife is more treated like, well, you're going to be wanted sexually and you have to be careful because he's going to want you that way. And of course, after you're married, you're going to have to be sexual or else he's going to go elsewhere. So you better, chop, you better offer that. So it's not like women are really treated like their own sexual agents. So a lot of times I feel like, yeah, women are offering themselves sexually, and they would even say consensually, but from this duty, obligatory, it's my job, it's my chore, I want to take care of him. I don't want him to suffer. I don't want him to be sad. Oh, but that's not really doing a whole lot for her desire or her, development as a sexual being.
Yeah. And so in those relationships, what often happens is the women are sexual because their husbands want them to be, and they think it's their job, just like what you're saying, a good wife does. And after a few years of that, it becomes aversive. And so they come in with no desire or with sexual aversion, where, if their husband even tries to say, I had one woman, her husband said, hey, babe, how about if I get a babysitter for the kids and we go out to dinner? And she would become nauseous and flushed and have a panic attack, because going out to dinner meant coming home meant we're supposed to have sex after a nice day out. And after years of service organization sex, her body was saying no because she verbally couldn't say no. So she became literally ill. And this happens a lot where it's not just doesn't happen to the aversion place, but it happens to the I'm really not interested, get it over with quick. And usually the husband is, well, part of my pleasure is your pleasure. So and so they come in to see me because it has turned from service organization sex to I'm going to throw up. So
yeah, that's exactly right. And by the way, we're talking about all these things because all of these things benefit from Sensate Focus exercises. So
correct.
Yes. Really quickly, I think, we talked briefly about orgasmic disorders. I think that would fall under the same thing. If you're not comfortable with your sexuality, if you're not comfortable with fantasies, if you're not comfortable with knowing your own body, that's going to affect, of course, your ability to orgasm. You briefly talked about vaginismus, or, not being comfortable with being penetrated. You might be comfortable with being sexual, but not necessarily having intercourse.
Correct.
And I think too, do you want to talk a little bit about erections and kind of sexual disorders that men have, like premature ejaculation, erectile disorders, even delayed ejaculation that can be tied to religious reasons?
Sure. So, for men, their messaging is that they should always have a rock hard diamond cutter, and that they're not even men if they don't have an erection. And most men, when they're teenagers, their erections are, a wind comes by and they have an erection, and they feel ashamed, especially if their religious background is that they're not supposed to be having sexual thoughts, but their erections come not even with sexual thoughts, any kind of rubbing against the pants or what have you. But as a man gets older, it becomes a little more difficult. It doesn't happen right away. They might need some direct stimulation to get an erection. But in terms of, religious belief and so on, I don't see that as a big problem that makes it worse for men in terms of being able to have erections. I see it as the culture in general tells men that if they aren't erect every single time, then there's something, and the moment a man goes, and then he starts watching to see if it's getting hard, if it's going to stay hard, and then the anxiety comes, and that's when the problems are. The Sensate Focus helps them relax, and they're told not to use their erection if they get one. So of course they get one because they don't have to use it. So there's no anxiety, okay, or lesser anxiety. So it works beautifully for that. Problems of rapid ejaculation. It used to be that women weren't supposed to like sex, and a good husband, only when he was really, 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 really having a hard time, would ask his wife for sex, and she would lie there and cover her face and okay, get it over with. And a good husband would not spend too much time because the woman wasn't supposed to enjoy it, and a good husband got it over with. So 2 or 3 minutes of intercourse before ejaculation, which is fairly common, unless a man is wired differently or learns to delay, or as he matures, he's more likely to delay. So it didn't used to be considered a problem. It used to be like, whoop-de-doo, we don't, because the number one operation at the turn of the century, voluntary operation, was removal of the clitoris of the female. If a good woman felt sexual pleasure in the Victorian era, one of the things that was done is clitoral removal, so she could be a good woman, okay, and not experience sexual feelings. So we were talking about men, though, so let me get back to the third difficulty, which is difficulty with erections is one, difficulty keeping an erection long enough for the partner, if she is into intercourse, to enjoy it. And the third is problems ejaculating at all. And so I see this quite often with people that have a lot of inhibitions about sex, that somehow it's related to spilling the seed, even though it's okay now. Somehow it still hooks that issue. I'm going to get someone pregnant, or I'm going to lose control, or this is not right. And so a lot of times that builds tension in the pelvis and an inhibition and not being able to ejaculate, which I see usually about the time that a couple, again, they could have a good sexual relationship, but then we come times like we want a baby, we want to conceive. In order to do that, my husband has to be able to ejaculate. So it could be part of a general inhibition caused by guilt about sexual pleasure, caused by fear of pregnancy if they have had sex earlier, intercourse sex. Maybe they even practiced pulling out, so that the idea of ejaculating and letting themselves have that pleasure and that natural experience becomes corrupted, and they're not able to do it. As an aside, sometimes I've seen people who have sexual dysfunctions, and I kind of laugh because it's like their genitals are smarter than they are. They're in a really bad relationship and they develop a sexual problem, and they try to work out the relationship and try to work out the sexual problem. And sometimes it's a really unhealthy relationship. And when they get into a healthier relationship, oh my God, they function again. Mm-hmm. Your genitals were smarter than you. They were saying no.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
well, that's what I even say about duty sex. I always tell women, your vagina doesn't know you're married.
That's right.
Your vagina doesn't know you love your husband and want to offer this as a kind gesture. Yes. Your vagina knows you're doing something out of duty and doesn't like it.
Exactly. Yeah, because it hasn't had a chance to have its natural unfolding. Yes.
Exactly. All right. Well, this has been obviously a wonderful conversation. I'd like to end with, throughout the book, you talked about the importance of touch, and you ended with a lot of beautiful, even research about touch. But yeah, can you just talk a little bit about what we know in regards to the impact of touch? And this is really just a human thing, regardless of your orientation, regardless of your libido or your drive, whether you're low libido, high libido, asexual, hypersexual. What do we know about the importance of skin-to-skin contact with another person?
What we know is that without skin-to-skin contact with another person, without touch, literally babies don't survive. Failure to thrive babies are babies that might be fed, but they're not being held and they're not experiencing skin-to-skin contact, and no one is kissing them and sniffing them and talking to them and putting their face to them and loving on them. That component of touch and affection is what allows the nutrients in the whatever they're taking, breast milk or some other nutrition, their bodies are not able to metabolize it. Even though they are getting the nutrition, their bodies can't metabolize it without touch. Touch is essential for survival for infants, and it's essential for survival for the elderly. You hear all the time about an elderly person who loses a spouse and they're gone not too long after that. And we all recognize that there are a lot of elderly people without partners that have a dog or a cat for that physical nurturing, or they go get their hair done, or they go get a massage, or they go to the chiropractor for an adjustment to be touched. That we find all sorts of other ways to get the touch we need to survive, because touch causes relaxation. It causes feel-good chemicals in the brain that ward off depression and anxiety. Touch actually improves immunity. They've got studies to show that being touched improves your immunity. It reduces pain because of the good feel-good chemicals are useful to moderate the feelings of pain. So your general mental, physical health, and your very survival depends on touch. And without touch, there's no bonding. Without bonding, there's no pairs. Without pairs, there's no reproduction. So touch is essential in every stage of our life.
Yeah, it's really kind of a beautiful thing, and why I think whether you're coupled or single, and especially if you're coupled, when I talk about physical intimacy, I talk about it from the entire spectrum, whether that includes your sexuality, but also your non-sexual touch, your affection for one another, and why it's so important. Because so many couples that I see where there are sexual issues, they'll avoid all touch.
Yes.
And I'm like, oh, wow. We have to we kind of have to look at touch from the entire spectrum, not just your sexuality together.
Yes.
So anyway, I think that's such a whole thing to be thinking about as a connective force. Is there anything I'm missing, or any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with in regards to your work, and in particular Sensate Focus, and how passionate you are about this?
Yes. So, I really think I certainly understand that we can't have a society in which everybody is just doing whatever feels good to them in the moment without consideration of the consequences. But I think limiting access to the other genders, limits comfort with other orientations and presentations and genders, limits us, makes us anxious around the opposite sex if we're heterosexual. I see this a lot with people that say are brought up in India, where they are in way separate schools and way separate societies, and then they get together for marriage, but they are terrified and terribly awkward. They've missed all the developmental, how do you talk to a girl? How do you kiss? What do you do with the saliva when you're deep kissing? How do you swallow it? All of those awkward experiences help create confidence and information. And I understand that we don't want to encourage people to be sexual and reproduce before they are able to handle themselves and another life. But on the other hand, I think we have some religious communities in which the guilt induction and the lack of naturalness is taught, or that's what's experienced by people. And so finding that balance to have sexual experiences that don't rock the boat too much, but provide some kind of baseline comfort with hand holding and kissing and some of the other kinds of activities that are quite normal. And we got to remember that we were married off at age 12 to 16. And now we're not married until we're 20 or older. So what do we do with natural sexual feelings in that time period? So I think we need to take a look at how society has changed and what might be realistic, and try not to control people's sexuality with fears and be too heavy. That's a pun. Be too heavy-handed.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I think that's a dilemma for a lot of parents who obviously have values and want their children to adhere to certain values, within their religious communities. And obviously the law of chastity is a really important value for so many Mormon parents. And yet, we want people to have good sexual lives, right? We want people to connect. We want our children to have some level of development, of experimentation. And again, the spectrum is wide, right? Like I see Mormon kids growing up in homes that are fairly sex positive, and joyous. And then I see kids growing up in homes where it's like, I hope you kiss for the first time across the wedding altar. And I'm like, I hope you don't. I hope that you have lots of kisses and even some touching and some Levi Lovin', whatever we call it, before that, because I think that it's in that experimentation and in those heartbreaks and in that body knowledge that kids prepare for some really important identity that will carry, and especially in our community where we do tend to marry a little younger than the rest of our peers. Mormons I think still marry fairly young. I mean, I think the national average is 26 to 27, and I think most Mormons are still marrying somewhere in their 20s to 23s. So that's, if you're going to marry that young, I think you need to have some experiences. And so I agree with you.
And I think you can save. If chastity is an important value, I think you can find ways to experience intimate pleasure without violating that ultimate rule, but getting more comfortable being a sexual person. who is saving the specialness of sex and reproduction for that specific marital partner. So I would love to see a little loosening of that, to get a little more experience in there. Yeah.
Yes. All right. Okay.
Okay.
We can do that.
Fabulous.
I think we can do that.
I hope we're not ridden out of town on a rail for saying that.
I think we can do that. Thank you so much, Linda, for
You're
your
welcome.
time today. This has been lovely. And I hope people have, are able to take some of these ideas and use them in helpful ways. So,
yeah.
And whether you're a therapist or whether you're somebody who's interested in Sensate Focus, I think this is a beautiful book. There's some beautiful illustrations that are all done, they're illustrations. So it's artistic. It's not, photographic, which also I think is helpful for people in regards to maybe some of their values in regards to explicit materials and having that be educational as far as how to do some of these exercises. And I think it's just lovely. So I'll make sure and link to at least an Amazon link to how to purchase the book.
Thank you.
I hope that our paths cross again sometime soon. So
absolutely.
Have a great rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles. And as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise, can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go. in her